Oye mira, it's Christian Ortiz, also known as ZacaTecho, and this is Cape On, a tech activist podcast. For those of you who have been following me for the last couple of years, you know that I've been doing some incredible work with language models, developing my own Justice AI GPT I built within ChatGPT's infrastructure to solve the bias problem. It's running on a decolonial data set that I built alongside a decolonial intelligence algorithmic framework. This is literally a framework that acts as a how-to for AI companies to learn how to build ethical tech, and also powers the ethics behind Justice AI to be able to identify bias in real time within OpenAI's bias dataset. If you've been following a lot of my work, especially in my previous episodes, then you know that I'm trying to decolonize AI across the board. One of the ways that I'm doing that is I'm taking my data and putting it and creating synthesized podcasts through Google's Notebook LM. Notebook LM just released their debate feature, an audio that you can create that synthesizes a debate on a podcast between two individuals. Now, kudos to Google's Notebook LM. They've diversified their voices, making several different choices for male voices, even including a Black American woman's voice. In a moment, I'm going to play that debate for you. I want you to take a close listen with a deeper ear. One voice defends my DIA framework, and one voice resists it. On the surface, it sounds like balance, like fairness, like a healthy discourse. Here's what I witnessed and what I want you to listen for. The first thing I saw was structural misogynoir. The voice chosen to defend my life's work, my system, my community's memory, was cast as a man, a white man, and the voice positioned to argue against the DIA framework, a Black woman. Not just any woman, but the sole racialized Black feminine voice in that AI simulated environment. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a script. This was misogynoir written in code. See, Notebook LM wants to appear diverse, and sure, it can simulate varied voices, but diversity without redistribution is theater. And assigning a Black woman to argue against the decolonial framework designed to protect her communities is actually not inclusion. It's algorithmic betrayal. And look, here's the deal. I'm the first to admit that this is not even intentional. What I will say is that language models replicate the system of whiteness to a T across the board. So these systems act like white men who center themselves in conversations and position people of the global majority in situations they don't need to be in. Here's what I want you to do. Listen to this debate, but listen plurally. When you hear transparency, I want you to ask, transparency for who? When you hear trustworthiness, ask, whose trust are we protecting? And when you hear calls for realism and practicality, ask, at what cost? And when you hear the voice of a Black woman arguing against her own liberation, remember, she didn't write the script. The system did.
Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today is on the profound challenge of algorithmic bias. Specifically, we're looking at it through the lens of a new, and I'd say highly provocative document, the Decolonial Intelligence Algorithmic, or DIA framework. And while the authors haven't just offered a critique, they assert this system is, and I quote, the first operational and documented system to solve the AI bias problem.
And that's quite a claim. It really hinges on a, let's say, radical philosophical shift, doesn't it? The DIA framework fundamentally challenges the existing governance models. It claims that algorithmic bias isn't some technical flaw we need to patch, but rather the intended outcome, essentially, of colonial logic embedded deep within data models and governance itself.
Exactly. Which really forces the central question we need to grapple with today. Does tackling algorithmic bias fundamentally require this kind of paradigm shift toward decolonial intelligence and, well, complete system replacement? Or can the established, more reformist governance frameworks, thinking here of the NIST AI risk management framework, IEEE's ethically aligned design, can those adequately address and mitigate the risks of bias as they exist now?
And I'll be arguing that, while yes, the DIA provides a really compelling diagnosis of systemic failure, those established frameworks they're essential. They're necessary tools for immediate practical risk mitigation. We really have to leverage and reform what we currently have available.
And I'll be taking the position that only the DIA framework's approach, this radical, systemic decolonization, can genuinely eliminate bias. The tools we're currently using, I argue, are fatally flawed by their very design, perpetually trying to correct harm within systems that are inherently unjust.
Well, the DIA diagnosis that AI is inherently political, reflecting, the Eurocentric values of its builders, that part is compelling, I grant you. But its wholesale rejection of existing systems seems unrealistic and, frankly, potentially delays meaningful progress we could be making right now.
But we have to push past this idea of just progress within the existing structure. The core issue, as the DIA points out, is that conventional fairness approaches, things like demographic parity or equalized odds, they all fail because they measure bias only within colonial categories, right? They manage bias like it's a distribution problem within a fundamentally flawed system. And in doing so, they just end up reforming whiteness instead of removing it. The DIA framework demands a complete restructuring of artificial intelligence. It needs to be built on principles like epistemic inclusion, community sovereignty, reparative justice, things that achieve bias elimination at the root, not just, marginal mitigation.
I understand the goal, the demand for root elimination. I do. However, established frameworks, particularly something like the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, the AIRMF, they offer something the DIA doesn't quite provide yet. A necessary, actionable, risk-based approach that's already being integrated into global compliance and regulatory structures.
But aren't the compliance structures themselves part of the problem?
Well, possibly. But NIST focuses on trustworthiness. It's a lifecycle management approach. It covers reliability, safety, transparency, accountability, and fairness. And similarly, the EEE-AID gives essential, high-level ethical guidance that institutions are actually adopting. These systems, like it or not, provide the structure for policy and legal compliance that the industry currently relies on to minimize immediate harms, maintain public safety. We can't just dismiss the only game in town, so to speak, until some complete societal shift magically occurs.
I would argue that focusing on trustworthiness within a colonial system is essentially trusting that system to continue inflicting harm. Just perhaps more transparently, the reliance on existing structures is the philosophical core of the problem. Conventional frameworks focus predominantly on managing technical risks, model accuracy, data fidelity, within the context of Western governance and power structures. This approach entirely ignores the foundational problem the DIA identifies: epistemic violence.
Okay, let's unpack that term a bit. Epistemic violence. So this is the harm caused by imposing one dominant knowledge system over others, right? Effectively erasing non-Western perspectives from the very foundation of the models.
Exactly. And the existing frameworks, simply by relying on Western-defined categories of risk and fairness, actively perpetuate it. DII is needed because it mandates epistemic decolonization. And what that means, practically, is integrating non-Western knowledge systems, indigenous, Afrocentric, global South perspectives, into the core of AI design, making sure systems are informed by a true plurality of perspectives from the start.
Okay, could you give a more concrete example? How does existing frameworks actively perpetuate this epistemic violence? And how would DII's approach fundamentally change the architecture?
Sure. Think about healthcare AI. Western-centric data, which is overwhelmingly based on specific demographics, leads to models that systematically fail to correctly diagnose conditions in, say, non-white populations. Now, that failure isn't just a glitch, it's the erasure of localized knowledge about disease presentation, symptomology, treatment efficacy in diverse bodies. Existing frameworks might mandate an audit. Okay, find the demographic error, suggest reweighting the data. A technical patch. DIA, on the other hand, through its pillars on decolonizing data collection, would mandate that the initial design of that diagnostic model itself is co-created with and defined by the epistemic framework of the community it's intended to serve. It changes the root definition of success entirely.
That level of inclusion is certainly desirable, yes.
But the existing frameworks do already mandate transparency, which is the necessary mechanism, isn't it, by which such errors are caught and hopefully corrected. I acknowledge that NIST and IEEE frameworks lean heavily on Western standards, but they do establish the foundational principles that DIA itself seems to require, specifically algorithmic transparency and accountability.
I'm not convinced that transparency, as defined by NISTs, is really sufficient. It often just amounts to providing a dense, pretty inaccessible model card that few can truly interpret. The DIA mandates mechanisms that go far beyond this kind of superficial audit theater. It demands things like community-led audits with binding norms and authority, ensuring genuine accountability to the affected populations. And furthermore, DIA includes the Comprehensive Intersectional Impact Assessment, IIA, which traditional fairness algorithms completely miss by treating identities in isolation, as if race, class, gender could ever be neatly disentangled in some spreadsheet.
I hear the demand for more robust, community-led audits, and I agree, those principles are crucial. And look, many of the technical mechanisms DIA promotes, clear, detailed model documentation, rigorous impact assessments, these are in many ways extensions of the transparency principles already championed by IEEE and NIST. The structures are there. Perhaps the inclusion needs strengthening, but let's address the elephant in the room regarding the DIA framework's actual existence.
Go on.
Well, for this revolutionary intellectual property, which is designed to dismantle colonial power structures, the DIA framework document states quite clearly it must be protected under U.S. and international copyright laws, specifically to shield it in a capitalist world. Now, isn't that a profound philosophical contradiction? You're relying on the very legal framework established by the global colonial powers you seek to dismantle in order to protect your solution from them.
Look, that is acknowledged within the framework itself as necessary legal armor. It's a strategic necessity to operate and survive in a system that is, let's face it, currently hostile to radical redistribution. It is a strategic concession to ensure the framework cannot simply be stolen, rebranded, and, incorporated as some minor technical feature within a Western corporate structure. Sometimes you have to use the master's tools for self-defense, not necessarily for remodeling the house entirely just yet.
But that necessity, that very need, actually proves my point about immediate practicality, doesn't it? The need to leverage the existing legal and regulatory system, the one defined by U.S. and international intellectual property law, it demonstrates that any radical reform has to operate through, or at least engage with, the established governance structures. If the revolutionary blueprint needs the old structure just to survive its launch, then perhaps we should focus on leveraging and reforming that structure for immediate impact, rather than waiting for a revolutionary shift that, frankly, may never fully arrive.
That line of reasoning, I think, confuses means with ends. We shouldn't mistake tactical engagement for philosophical acceptance. We need to focus on what the DIA actually promises: bias elimination, not just management or mitigation. The DIA framework formalizes its resolution through something called the decolonial proof of bias resolution. It asserts mathematically that conventional fairness constraints are, quote, epistemically incomplete by construction, precisely because they rest on these stolen categories.
Okay, that's an incredibly strong claim. A mathematical proof of bias resolution. What does that actually look like conceptually? I mean, bias is fundamentally a social and political phenomenon, isn't it? How do you prove its resolution mathematically?
It means that DIA moves beyond just statistical proxies for fairness. You see, colonial metrics define fairness by asking, are the harms distributed equally across these predefined, externally imposed demographic groups? DIA aims for bias elimination by establishing intersectional consistency, IC, as the gold standard. Now, IC requires consistency not just across simple categories, but consistency across complex, intersectional, and crucially, locally defined social and political contexts. This means the framework's performance must be irreducible to those statistical metrics that rely on the old colonial categories. IC essentially ensures that an AI system performs justly regardless of which non-Western epistemic framework you might apply to evaluate it.
Okay,
I think I grasp the concept, but I come at it from a different angle. The IIC standard and the broader mandate for things like reparative justice and full data sovereignty, these present systemic demands that seem to dramatically exceed the mandate of technical ethics frameworks. This moves well beyond technical guidance into deep global economic and political restructuring, doesn't it?
And that is precisely the point. AI bias is deeply intertwined with economic and political structures. If AI systems are built on data extracted from marginalized communities without fair compensation or control, that is neocolonial extraction. The IIC framework makes this structural change tangible through specific technical mandates. For example, it mandates tools like permission blockchain models and smart contracts. These are tools to ensure communities maintain control and actually benefit financially from the value generated by their data.
Right. Can you clarify how blockchain technology specifically addresses reparative justice in this context? How does that work practically?
Absolutely. So, imagine a community's data is used to train a valuable AI model. Let's say an agricultural prediction model in the Global South. The blockchain can act as an immutable ledger, tracking ownership and usage rights. Then, smart contracts automatically execute revenue sharing based on pre-agreed terms. This actively prevents the extractive practices where, global north companies use local knowledge and data, generate billions in revenue, and give little or nothing back to the source community. DIA flips that script. The community retains data sovereignty, and the smart contract enforces economic redistribution. It turns potential data extraction into a mechanism for reparative justice.
That technical vision is, well, it's highly compelling, I admit, but the political feasibility seems astronomical. While mandates like Global South leadership quotas on all AI oversight bodies or economic redistribution via smart contracts are morally compelling, their implementation requires sweeping legal and political action that no single technical ethics framework, whether it's NIST, IEEE, or DAA, can compel unilaterally. That's a global political project.
But if we don't build the architecture that enables that redistribution, it will certainly never happen. The technology here provides the blueprint, the potential infrastructure for the necessary political change.
But we cannot just halt all immediate progress while we wait for global society to instantaneously adopt and replace the entire regulatory infrastructure. The focus, I still maintain, must remain on strengthening the existing systems for immediate demonstrable risk mitigation. And we do see compelling real-world examples in the source material itself where immediate reform led to better outcomes today.
Are you referring to the Justice AI example in dermatology?
Yes, exactly. In Denver, Justice AI was used to correct the misdiagnosis of serious dermatological conditions in patients of color. These were misdiagnoses rooted in historical biases in traditional medical diagnostics based on Eurocentric datasets. This was an immediate, practical reform of technical and data processes that led to tangible, better outcomes right now. It demonstrates that rigorous technical implementation can succeed in mitigating historical bias within the current system's operational scope.
I fundamentally disagree with the conclusion you draw from that example. You're using a tool arguably built on DIIA-like principles. Justice AI focuses on intersectionality and explicit historical correction to highlight flaws that the standard reformist frameworks failed to prevent in the first place. That corrective action only confirms the systemic failure of the colonial baseline. Relying on NIST and IEEE means constantly playing catch-up, constantly correcting historical harm rather than preventing it by design. We need to move beyond just fixing the failures of whiteness, as the DII puts it, to building something entirely new.
But we have to recognize that the journey to that total system replacement is likely long and politically fraught. The existing governance systems, NIST, IEEE, they provide the operational structure needed now to enforce immediate, necessary technical mitigations. Mitigations required to save lives and protect rights today, even if we acknowledge they are epistemically incomplete. We must refine them, push them toward the ideals the DI outlines, rather than discarding them entirely while we wait.
Well, ultimately, I think both perspectives confirm that AI biasing is fundamentally a deeply political problem. It's rooted in structural power imbalances, not just some software bug.
Absolutely. On that diagnosis, I think we completely agree.
The DIA framework, though, insists that this bias is not a technical failure, but a structural design. And that means attempts to simply reform the system without removing the underlying colonial baseline are ultimately guaranteed to fail in the long run. We have to move beyond, tokenistic inclusion and superficial audit theater, toward genuine decolonial AI governance, where affected communities actually have binding norms and real authority over the technology that impacts them. Only a framework that centers liberation, community control, and epistemic completeness, as DIA aims to do, can truly fulfill the promise of technology actually serving the global majority.
And I'd say the DIA framework serves as a crucial, perhaps transformative manifesto. It accurately identifies the Eurocentric limitations of current governance standards and provides a potential architectural blueprint for a more just future. However, the existing frameworks from NIST and IEEE are established tools. They provide a necessary foundation right now for managing technical risks and ensuring corporate accountability in the near term. So while fully acknowledging the need for the radical, systemic changes the DIA demands, I believe immediate, practical progress relies on leveraging and strengthening these established standards. We need to achieve necessary mitigation today, even as we strive towards the greater ideals of decolonial AI governance perhaps tomorrow. There's clearly more to explore in how these two approaches might, maybe paradoxically, inform one another moving forward.